The fog in Seattle doesn't just roll in off Puget Sound. It creeps. It wraps itself around the concrete pillars of the city like a living thing, damp, heavy, and smelling of salt and decay. It seizes the glass and steel monoliths and muffles the roar of the I-5, turning a bustling metropolis into a silent, ghostly panopticon. For 15 years, that fog hasn't stayed outside. It has lived inside my home, thick and suffocating, clinging to the mahogany furniture, seeping into the imported Italian leather of the sofas, and settling deep into the marrow of my bones. Our waterfront mansion in Magnolia is an architectural masterpiece designed to capture the breathtaking sweep of the Sound and the distant silhouette of the Olympic Mountains. To the outside world, the Elliott Estate is the epitome of the American dream realized, a stunning modern sanctuary where success, wealth, and domestic bliss supposedly intersect under designer vaulted ceilings. People look at Clara and me and see perfection. She is 51, with hair the color of polished chestnut, cheekbones carved by the finest plastic surgeons in Beverly Hills, and a posture that suggests she was born looking down on everyone else. I am 54, a self-made real estate developer whose skin has weathered decades of boardrooms, cold winter negotiations, and the silent, grinding pressure of being a man who entered a high society bloodline with nothing but a briefcase and a ferocious, burning ambition. Or at least, that is the lie we have carefully cultivated for public consumption. Behind the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, behind the art pieces worth more than a suburban subdivision, our house is a mausoleum. The silence here isn't peaceful, it is armed. Every dinner table conversation is a calculated chess match where my pieces are constantly being knocked over by invisible, sneering hands. It started again this morning, precisely at 6:30 a.m., just as the first gray sliver of dawn struggled to pierce the Seattle gloom. I was sitting at the massive quartz kitchen island, a cup of black coffee cooling in front of me, staring at the faint reflection of my own tired eyes in the polished surface. My hair is thinning now, heavily salted with gray, and the lines around my mouth are deep trenches carved by a decade and a half of swallowing words that could have ended in murder. "Don't leave your mug there, Thomas." Clara's voice cut through the stillness, crisp, melodic, and dripping with an effortless, casual cruelty that she had perfected over the years. "The cleaning service comes at 7, and I refuse to have them running around picking up after your provincial habits. Honestly, after all these years in this house, you'd think you'd develop some basic spatial awareness. But I suppose old habits from a trailer park die hard, don't they?" She didn't look up from her iPad, her manicured fingers scrolling effortlessly through high-end portfolio updates while she sipped her organic matcha latte. She wore a silk cashmere robe that cost more than my first used pickup truck, her bare feet resting casually on the heated hardwood floor. I didn't flinch. I didn't let my expression ripple. I merely picked up the heavy ceramic mug, took a slow, measured sip of the bitter liquid, and set it down precisely on the coaster she had designated for me 3 years ago, like a piece of institutional property. "My apologies, Clara," I said, my voice flat, devoid of any warmth, playing the part of the submissive, domesticated husband I had carefully played for 5,475 days. "I'll be more mindful." She offered a soft, dismissive hum, a sound that communicated louder than any shouting could ever manage. "You are a guest here. You are an employee who got lucky enough to sign a marriage license." This was the daily currency of my existence. For 15 years, Clara had systematically eroded my dignity, turning our marriage into an endless psychological torture chamber. When we met, I was a hungry, aggressive young land developer trying to make a footprint in the Pacific Northwest. Her father, the late Arthur Sterling, was the undisputed king of Seattle real estate, a ruthless old-school tycoon who built his empire on blood, contracts, and municipal bribery. Arthur hated me at first sight. He saw me as a scavenger circling his golden kingdom. But Clara, in her rebellious 20s, had fancied herself an avant-garde bohemian and decided I was her pet project. We married in a lavish ceremony overlooking Lake Washington, an event splashed across the society pages of the Seattle Times. Within 6 months, Arthur died under mysterious, sudden circumstances. A massive stroke brought on by an unexpected cardiac arrest in his private study. just a week after altering his will to hand over 51% of Sterling Holdings to his beloved daughter, with a strict clause leaving me, her husband, as a managing executive with zero voting equity. Clara took over the throne, and the day after her father's funeral, the dynamic shifted permanently. The loving wife vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating heiress who viewed me as nothing more than a glorified tenant, a kept man who owed his very breath to the Sterling bloodline. "Mom, is the Porsche ready?" The sharp, entitled voice sliced through the heavy kitchen air as our daughter, Chloe, sauntered into the room. At 22, she was a carbon copy of Clara in her youth, stunning, narcissistic, and fiercely ambitious. She wore an oversized designer sweatshirt, her phone glued to her palm as she FaceTimed a classmate while grabbing a handful of blueberries. "Your father had the driver pull it around 20 minutes ago," Clara replied without looking up. "Make sure you drop your brother off at his prep school on the way. Liam has lacrosse practice and he needs to stop dragging his feet." Liam, our 17-year-old son, entered behind his sister. He was tall, lean, and always looked like he wanted to dissolve into the wallpaper. He didn't look at Clara, and he barely glanced at me. He grabbed an apple, mumbled a barely audible goodbye, and walked out toward the mudroom. I watched him go, feeling a familiar, heavy ache in my chest. Liam was the quiet one, the collateral damage of a household at war with itself. He spent most of his time locked in his room, surrounded by gaming consoles and sketchpads, retreating into digital worlds because the real one was entirely uninhabitable. As Chloe slammed the heavy glass front door behind her, the house fell back into its eerie, oppressive hush. Only Clara and I remained in the vast, sterile kitchen. And then the front door clicked open again. Footsteps echoed softly on the herringbone oak floor. Heavy, confident strides that belonged to a man who felt entirely at home in my bed, at my dining table, and in my corporate offices. Julian Vance walked into the kitchen, smelling faintly of expensive Tom Ford cologne and damp wool. Julian was 39, sleek as a panther, with slicked-back dark hair, razor-sharp silver-rimmed glasses, and an expensive bespoke suit that hugged his lean frame. He was Sterling Holdings' chief legal counsel, my hand-picked protege from 5 years ago, whom I had personally brought into the firm, mentored, trusted, and eventually promoted to executive partner. A man who had repaid my trust by systematically sinking his teeth into my wife, my assets, and my jugular. Julian didn't bother greeting me. He walked straight up behind Clara, leaned over the back of her velvet armchair, and pressed a lingering, incredibly familiar kiss directly onto the nape of her neck. Clara tilted her head back, her face softening into an expression of genuine, breathless affection that I hadn't seen directed at me since the first year of our marriage. "Morning, darling," Julian murmured, his voice smooth like liquid poison. Then he glanced over at me, his lips curling into a tight, mocking smirk that barely registered as a smile. "Morning, Thomas. You're up early, still playing at being a developer, or did the board finally convince you to step down and enjoy your retirement?" The disrespect was casual, practiced, and entirely unmasked. In this house, Julian wasn't just the lawyer, he was the de facto man of the manor. Everyone knew it. The housekeepers whispered about it behind the pantry doors. The executive board members at Sterling Holdings exchanged knowing glances whenever Julian countermanded my architectural proposals with a flick of his wrist. I kept my face completely blank, staring directly into Julian's cold, triumphant blue eyes. Underneath the table, my right hand slowly closed into a tight, white-knuckled fist, my fingernails digging deep into my palm until I felt the dull sting of pain grounding me. "Not yet," I told myself, repeating the mantra I had lived by for the past 2,000 nights. Let them gorge. Let them think the cage is locked from the outside. "Good morning, Julian," I said, my voice steady, measured, almost musical in its calmness. "I was just reviewing the waterfront zoning permits for the Bellevue project. It seems there are a few legal discrepancies that require your immediate attention. Wouldn't want any structural flaws in the paperwork to bring down the whole enterprise, would we?" Julian's smirk tightened by a fraction of a millimeter. For a split second, a flash of genuine unease crossed his face, a shadow of panic that quickly vanished behind his professional arrogance. He knew as well as I did that the corporate landscape was shifting, but he believed he and Clara held all the high cards. He believed the trap they had been building around me for the past 6 months was fully sprung. Clara turned slightly in her chair, finally looking directly at me. Her eyes were hard, glittering like frosted glass under the morning chandelier. "Save your corporate jargon for the office, Thomas," she said coldly, standing up and smoothing down the front of her silk robe, her tall frame towering over the island. "Though, speaking of the office, you won't need to worry about zoning permits much longer. Julian and I spent yesterday evening with the board's executive committee. We've restructured the voting shares. As of Friday afternoon, your executive title is being formally dissolved, and your personal holdings in the joint accounts are being frozen pending a comprehensive financial audit." There it was, the opening salvo. They weren't even bothering to hide it behind closed doors anymore. The coup was fully underway. They were going to strip me of my title, lock me out of my accounts, declare me mentally unstable due to the stress of the business, and push me out onto the Seattle rain-slicked streets with nothing more than the clothes on my back and a tarnished reputation. On audit? I raised an eyebrow, letting out a dry, humorless chuckle that seemed to unnerve Clara just a fraction. "That sounds thorough, Clara. Are you sure you want an audit? Sometimes when you open old ledgers, you find things that were buried very, very deep, things that might drag down more than just my name." Julian stepped forward, placing himself squarely between me and Clara, his chest puffed out like a territorial bantam cock. "Don't threaten her, Thomas. You're playing a game you lost months ago. Every signature is verified. Every legal loophole has been sewn shut by my own hand. You're a relic, a ghost rattling chains in a house that doesn't belong to you." He reached down and casually picked up my coffee mug, taking a sip before grimacing and pouring the rest down the stainless steel sink drain, watching the dark liquid swirl away into the pipes. "You should drink your coffee faster next time," Julian whispered, leaning down close to my ear, his breath hot and reeking of mint and malice. "Or better yet, stop making coffee in a house where you don't even own the cups." I didn't move. I didn't lunge. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a violent outburst that they could record on their hidden security feeds and hand over to the local precinct as proof of my unhinged psychological collapse. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, crossed my legs, and offered them a slow, serene smile, the kind of smile that makes predators second-guess whether their prey is actually cornered or if they've just walked straight into an abattoir. "Enjoy your morning, Julian," I whispered back, my voice barely audible above the hum of the refrigerator. "And enjoy the view from the top while it lasts. The air gets very thin up there, and the fall from a Seattle waterfront cliff is terribly final." Clara shuddered involuntarily, her gaze darting to mine with a sudden, sharp spike of unease. She opened her mouth to say something, perhaps to snap another insult, but the phone in her pocket buzzed insistently, shattering the tension. She turned away, pulling out her device while Julian flashed one last triumphant grin before following her toward the double doors leading to the subterranean garage. As the heavy oak doors swung shut, sealing them off in their little world of supreme arrogance and illicit passion, I remained seated at the kitchen island. The mansion was dead silent once more, save for the faint, melancholic howling of the wind sweeping off the Puget Sound, carrying the cold breath of an oncoming storm. They thought they had won. They thought the net was closed, the executioner's axe was raised, and the lonely old husband was standing helplessly on the scaffold. They had no idea that the foundation of this entire house had been poured over quicksand, and that I was the one holding the valve to flood the basement. I stood up slowly, straightened my tie, and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. Outside, the Seattle fog was rolling in thicker now, swallowing the coastline entirely, turning the world into a gray, featureless blank slate. Perfect for a vanishing act. Perfect for a reckoning. The rain in Seattle does not fall. It lingers, hanging in the air like a fine gray mist that penetrates your woolen coat and settles right against your skin. By Friday evening, the atmospheric pressure had dropped so severely that the air inside our Magnolia waterfront mansion felt dense, almost gelatinous, pressing down on the chest with a physical weight. It was the kind of evening that made you want to lock all the doors, stoke the fireplace, and pretend the rest of the world had ceased to exist. Instead, our living room felt less like a sanctuary and more like a depopulated courtroom waiting for the judge to bang the gavel. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass wall, watching the dark, churning waters of Puget Sound crash against the reinforced concrete seawall below. The city lights across the bay blinked through the relentless drizzle like distant, indifferent stars. Behind me, the muffled clinking of crystal and silver echoed softly from the formal dining room. Clara was hosting an intimate gathering, or rather, an execution masquerading as a dinner party. She had invited Arthur Sterling's closest circle of corporate loyalists, old guard board members who still viewed Sterling Holdings as an untouchable feudal kingdom, alongside 2 senior partners from Vance & Associates, Julian's law firm. I didn't sit at the head of the table. For the past week, my seat had quietly vanished, replaced by an empty space that symbolized my impending erasure. But tonight, I had my own agenda. Inside the deep pocket of my bespoke wool trousers rested a slim, encrypted flash drive. It contained every digital crumb, every offshore wire transfer, every forged corporate resolution, and every illicit text message traded between Clara and Julian over the past 3 years. They thought they had backed me into a corner, locking all the exits with airtight legal instruments. They had no idea that I had spent the last 6 months quietly reinforcing the floorboards beneath their feet, turning their fortress into a glass cage primed for a controlled demolition. Thomas. Clara's voice cut through the muted hum of conversation like a scalpel. She glided across the hardwood floor in a stunning, backless emerald gown that caught the amber glow of the chandelier. Her hair was swept up into a severe, elegant chignon, exposing the sharp, aristocratic line of her jaw. She held a crystal flute of vintage Dom Perignon, her green eyes glittering with a toxic cocktail of triumph and undisguised contempt. She stopped a few feet away from me, making sure the rest of the room could see the deliberate distance she maintained between us. "I see you're still lingering," she said, pitching her voice just loud enough for the board members seated nearby to catch every syllable. "Though I would have thought packing your personal effects into a modest suitcase would have kept you occupied by now. The couriers are scheduled to drop your boxes at your downtown apartment by midnight." A low, collective chuckle rippled through the nearby armchairs. Julian Vance leaned back against the marble mantelpiece, swirling a glass of amber scotch, his face split by that insufferable predatory grin. He looked every bit the triumphant conqueror, the young, brilliant legal mind who had outmaneuvered the aging, out-of-touch patriarch and claimed both the empire and the empress. I turned slowly from the window, letting my gaze drift over Clara's face, tracing the lines of arrogance that had calcified there over a decade and a half. "My apartment, Clara?" I asked, my voice preternaturally calm, carrying a steady, rhythmic cadence that made the small cluster of laughing executives suddenly fall silent. "That's terribly generous of you, though considering whose signature is actually on the deed of that downtown property, I would imagine you'll be the one needing a new zip code by sunrise." Clara's smile tightened, the glass flute trembling ever so slightly in her manicured fingers. A flicker of genuine irritation crossed her features, quickly masked by practiced disdain. "You are delusional, Thomas," she hissed softly, stepping closer so only I could hear the venom in her tone. "The restructuring documents were executed under Section 42 of the corporate charter. Every share, every title, every asset has been legally reassigned to a trust held in my name, signed by your own hand during our corporate retreat in Whistler 3 months ago. You have nothing. You are a legal non-entity in this house and in this company." "Ah, Section 42, I replied, tilting my head with an expression of mild academic curiosity. "A brilliant clause, Julian. Truly masterful drafting." I shifted my eyes toward the fireplace where Julian stood. "The way you embedded that indemnity waiver inside the routine environmental compliance audit for the Bellevue development. It's almost poetic. Anyone would have signed it without reading the fine print." Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his posture stiffening against the marble. "If you have grievances regarding corporate governance, Thomas, you can file your complaints through proper legal channels," he said smoothly, though a subtle edge of tension had crept into his baritone. "Though given your current financial exposure, I doubt any reputable firm would take your retainer." "Legal channels?" I let out a soft, low chuckle that seemed to scrape against the heavy silence of the room. "Julian, my dear boy, who said anything about filing complaints?" I reached slowly into my pocket, pulled out the small metallic flash drive, and held it up between my thumb and forefinger, letting the crystal chandelier light catch its polished surface. "Tonight, we bypass the courts entirely," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the entire dining room. "We're going straight to the public record. Every wire transfer to the Cayman Islands, every falsified medical report regarding your father-in-law's final days, Clara. And of course, Julian, the complete transactional history of how you systematically embezzled $4 million from the corporate pension fund to buy your vacation home in Cabo San Lucas. It's all right here. High-definition evidence, time-stamped, decrypted, and currently uploading to the SEC, the Seattle Times, and a federal prosecutor who owes me a very old favor." The color drained entirely from Clara's face. The emerald green of her dress seemed to mock the sudden pallor of her skin. Julian slammed his scotch glass down onto the marble mantelpiece so hard the crystal cracked, the amber liquid spilling out like fresh blood across the white stone. "You arrogant old bastard!" Julian shouted, taking 2 rapid steps forward, his professional composure completely shattering under the weight of panic. "You're bluffing. There is no flash drive. Give that to me." He lunged forward, his hand clawing out to snatch the device from my fingers. But before he could take a third step, the deep, heavy silence of the night outside was violently punctured. Wee-woo, wee-woo, wee-woo. The shrill, piercing wail of multiple police sirens cut through the Seattle mist, echoing off the concrete walls of the waterfront. Headlights flashed in rapid succession across the massive glass windows of the foyer, painting the white marble entrance in pulsating strokes of aggressive blue and red. The entire room froze. The board members sat paralyzed in their chairs, glasses suspended halfway to their mouths, their eyes darting nervously between Clara, Julian, and me. Footsteps pounded heavily on the paved stone pathway outside the front entrance. Heavy, boots-on-the-ground footsteps. Not the quiet tread of guests, but the unmistakable rhythm of an armed tactical unit. Clara whipped her head toward the grand foyer, her voice trembling as she clutched at the collar of her dress. What is that? Did you call the police, Thomas? Have you lost your mind?" "No, Clara," I said, slipping the flash drive back into my pocket with agonizing slowness, my eyes locked onto her dilated pupils. "I didn't call the police. I called the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the State Financial Crimes Division. But don't worry, they aren't here for a domestic dispute." Before Clara could process the words, the heavy double oak doors of the mansion were violently kicked open from the outside. "FBI, nobody move! Hands where we can see them!" The deep barking command echoed through the vaulted ceilings as half a dozen tactical officers poured into the foyer, clad in black Kevlar vests, helmets, and assault rifles held at the ready. The red and blue lights from the cruiser fleet outside flashed wildly against the high-end artwork and Persian rugs, turning the luxurious living room into a surreal war zone. Julian's face went chalk white. He instinctively stepped back, his hands raised defensively, stammering toward the lead agent who strode into the center of the room. "There's been a mistake!" Julian shouted, trying to flash his corporate badge as legal counsel. "I am Julian Vance, Chief Legal Officer of Sterling Holdings. This is a private residence. You have no jurisdiction." The lead agent, a tall, burly man with silver-streaked hair and cold gray eyes, completely ignored Julian. Instead, the agent bypassed the panicked lawyer, walked straight past the trembling board members, and stopped dead in front of me. My breath caught for a split second. A cold knot twisted in my stomach. The script I had memorized, the trap I had spent 6 months laying, the master plan to dismantle Clara and Julian's financial empire, none of it included what happened next. The federal agent didn't look at Clara. He didn't look at Julian. He reached behind his back, unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs, and stepped directly into my personal space. "Thomas Elliot?" the agent demanded, his voice flat, devoid of any human warmth. "Yes," I answered, my brow furrowing as a deep, creeping sense of dread began to wash over my chest. "I am Thomas Elliot. I am the one who filed the—" "Thomas Elliot, you are under arrest for corporate fraud, grand larceny, international money laundering, and the illegal transfer of over $40 million in corporate assets," the agent barked, cutting me off with brutal finality. Before I could utter a single word of protest, the heavy steel of the handcuffs slammed onto my wrists, biting hard into my skin with a cold, metallic snap. The room erupted into absolute chaos. "What?" I yelled, twisting around as the agents grabbed my arms, forcing me down onto the marble floor. "Are you insane? Look at the flash drive. Look at the documents. They are the criminals. Clara, Julian, they forged—" "Shut him up!" Clara shrieked, her voice shifting instantly from panic to a terrifying razor-sharp venom. The color had rushed back into her face, replaced not by fear, but by a chilling, triumphant smirk that matched the exact look Julian had worn just moments before. Clara straightened her emerald gown, stepped over toward the lead federal agent, and handed him a pristine leather-bound folder bearing the official seal of Sterling Holdings. "Thank you, Agent Miller," Clara said smoothly, her voice dripping with an icy, aristocratic relief. "My husband's mental state has deteriorated severely over the past 6 months, as our medical records and corporate filings clearly indicate. We tried to help him, but his obsession with embezzling company funds finally crossed the line into criminality." I stopped struggling. The cold steel of the handcuffs felt like lead weights on my wrists as my brain raced, desperately trying to reverse engineer the nightmare unfolding around me. I looked from Agent Miller to Clara, and then to Julian, whose earlier panic had completely vanished, replaced by a slow, venomous smile of absolute victory. "The signatures," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow to the sternum. "The corporate retreat in Whistler. The digital signature on the restructuring documents." Julian stepped forward, leaning down just enough for me to see the malicious gleam in his eyes. "Did you really think I'd leave our entire future to chance, Thomas?" Julian whispered softly, his voice a poisonous hiss meant only for my ears. "That flash drive you've been carrying around like a loaded gun? We planted it on your server 3 weeks ago. Every single offshore transaction, every illegal wire transfer, every piece of fabricated evidence points directly to your IP address, your personal keys, and your encrypted credentials." He reached out, casually tapping the metallic edge of the flash drive still protruding slightly from my trouser pocket. "You didn't uncover our trap, Thomas," Julian smiled, standing back up and adjusting his bespoke lapels. "You walked right into the center of it, signed your name on the dotted line, and delivered yourself bound and gagged to the federal penitentiary." Agent Miller grabbed me firmly by the shoulder, hauling me to my feet. "Let's move, Mr. Elliott. You'll have plenty of time to explain your complex corporate theories to a federal judge." As the tactical officers dragged me toward the double doors, out into the freezing Seattle rain and the flashing red and blue lights, I caught one last glimpse of the living room. Clara was standing beside Julian, her glass of Dom Perignon refilled, raising a silent toast to the empty space where I had stood just minutes ago. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind me, cutting off the warmth of the mansion, swallowing me whole into the freezing, relentless fog of the Seattle night. They thought they had won. They thought the cage was locked from the outside, and the key had been thrown into the abyss of the Pacific. But as the cold rain soaked through my shirt, and the cruiser doors locked behind me with a heavy, final thud, a dark, chilling smile slowly spread across my face in the shadows of the back seat. A clever predator never shows all his teeth on the first hunt. And the game, as it turned out, hadn't even truly begun. The King County Correctional Facility downtown does not smell like the Pacific Northwest. It smells of industrial bleach, cold concrete, sweat, and the distinct metallic tang of institutional despair. The holding cell was a box of cinder blocks painted an aggressive, soul-crushing shade of institutional green, lit by a flickering fluorescent tube that buzzed with a low, rhythmic hum capable of driving a sane man to the edge of psychosis within 48 hours. For 3 days, I sat on the bolted steel bunk, staring at my hands. The heavy steel handcuffs had left dark, bruised rings around my wrists, a physical reminder of how cleanly and efficiently Clara and Julian had severed my head from my empire. According to the public defender assigned to me, a nervous young woman with eyes full of pity, who clearly believed I was a senile, embezzling executive past his prime, the federal prosecutor was pushing for a fast-track indictment. With the forged wire transfers, the manipulated server logs, and the airtight restructuring documents bearing my digital signature, the case was considered a slam dunk. Sterling Holdings had already issued a pristine, highly sanitized press release announcing my voluntary medical leave and subsequent retirement, while Clara had stepped into the role of interim CEO, basking in the sympathy of the Seattle business community. They had won. Every piece of the puzzle clicked together with terrifying precision. I was a ghost in my own life, locked away behind 3-inch thick tempered glass, while my wife and her lover toasted my ruin in a magnolia mansion built on the blood and capital of a stolen legacy. Or so they believed. On the fourth morning, the heavy steel door clanked open. A bored guard with a toothpick wedged in the corner of his mouth called out my name. "Elliot, visitor in booth 3. You've got 10 minutes, old man. Don't make me pull you out." I didn't speak. I stood up slowly, letting my joints pop, and shuffled out into the cold corridor, my orange jumpsuit dragging slightly against the polished concrete. I was escorted down the narrow hallway, past screaming inmates and heavy wire mesh, until I reached booth 3, a small claustrophobic cubicle divided down the center by a thick sheet of scratched bulletproof glass, equipped with an encrypted telephone receiver mounted on the wall. I sat down on the bolted metal stool and picked up the heavy plastic receiver. On the other side of the glass, the visitor's chair was already occupied. But it wasn't Clara. It wasn't a federal investigator, nor was it the nervous public defender. It was Liam. My 17-year-old son sat slumped in the metal chair, wearing his high-end prep school blazer, his dark hair falling messily over his forehead. He didn't look up immediately. He kept his eyes fixed on the heavy wooden table between us, his fingers nervously tracing the frayed edge of his sleeve. For years, Liam had been the invisible ghost of our household, the quiet, withdrawn boy who spent his weekends locked in his bedroom sketching digital art while his mother and sister screamed or sneered around him. He was the collateral damage, the child everyone ignored because he didn't possess Chloe's aggressive narcissism or Clara's polished cruelty. Slowly, Liam lifted his head. His eyes met mine through the scratched glass. They weren't watery, nor were they filled with the terrified grief a teenager should feel seeing his father locked in a federal holding cell. They were cold, flat, and unnervingly composed, the exact same dead-eyed stare I had seen in my own mirror during my darkest hours. I picked up the receiver and pressed it against my ear. Liam mirrored the motion on the other side. "You shouldn't be here, Liam," I said, my voice raspy from disuse, carrying through the muffled static of the intercom speaker. "The press are swarming the estate. If your mother finds out you came down here to visit a disgraced, bankrupt criminal, she'll make your life at the academy a living hell." Liam didn't blink. He stared at me for a long, agonizing moment before letting out a dry, humorless breath that barely registered as a chuckle. "Mom thinks I'm at my after-school art tutorial," Liam said, his voice surprisingly deep, steady, and entirely devoid of youthful tremor. "She doesn't care where I am, Dad. Right now, she and Julian are too busy celebrating in the home office, popping vintage champagne and dividing up your vintage watch collection like vultures over a fresh carcass. They think you're completely neutralized. They think the game is over." A cold thrill ran down my spine, sharp and sudden. I leaned forward, pressing my chest closer to the glass partition. "Why are you here, Liam?" I asked, my tone dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "You didn't come all the way downtown just to deliver a status report on your mother's celebration." Liam's fingers stopped tracing his sleeve. He reached slowly into the inside pocket of his prep school blazer, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He pulled out a small, matte black electronic device, a high-end portable solid-state drive encased in titanium, no larger than a pack of chewing gum. He held it up against the glass, pressing the flat surface directly against the scratched plastic so I could see the serial numbers etched into the back. "I'm here because I want to make sure the right person wins," Liam said softly, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that sent a genuine shiver through my spine. "What is that?" I asked, my breath catching in my throat. "That," Liam replied, a faint, chilling smile touching the corners of his lips, "is insurance and payback. Everything your brilliant legal counsel Julian forgot to wipe from the domestic server before he locked you out of the network." I stared at the black drive against the glass, my mind racing through a dozen different scenarios. "How did you—" "The server room is protected by biometric security. Only Clara and Julian have administrator access. Mom and Julian think technology is something you buy with a platinum credit card," Liam said, his voice dripping with quiet contempt. "They don't understand how it actually works. While Julian was busy forging your signature on corporate restructuring docs, he forgot that I built the home automation network when I was 14. He left the master backup protocol routed directly through my bedroom node so he could stream movies without slowing down the main house Wi-Fi. I've had remote root access to every single file, email, and keystroke in this house for the last 3 years. The silence in the small booth became deafening. The buzzing fluorescent light overhead seemed to grow louder, grinding against my eardrums. I looked at my 17-year-old son, the quiet, neglected boy who spent his life hiding behind sketch pads, and realized for the first time that I didn't truly know any of my children at all. 3 years? I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. You've known about Clara and Julian for 3 years? I knew before they even started sleeping together, Liam corrected smoothly, his expression chillingly detached. I watched Julian groom Mom into a weapon against you. I watched them mock you every single morning at that quartz island, laughing at how easily you swallowed their insults because you were trying to keep the family together for our sake. Do you know what it's like, Dad, listening to them plot how to destroy the only parent who ever actually looked at me in that mausoleum? A heavy, suffocating weight settled over my chest. For 15 years I had swallowed every piece of degradation, every thuggish insult, every act of psychological violence, believing I was shouldering the cross entirely alone to protect my family. And all along, sitting right beside me in the dark, was a boy watching the same machinery grind me down, quietly building his own weapons in the digital shadows. "What's on that drive, Liam?" I asked, my voice steadying, hardening into something cold and razor-sharp. "Everything," Liam said, leaning forward until his face was inches from the glass. "Every recorded phone call where Julian coached Mom on how to fake your mental health decline. Every financial transfer moving sterling funds into their offshore accounts in the Caymans. And..." He paused, his smile vanishing completely, replaced by a dark, sinister shadow. "And something much bigger. Something that goes back 15 years. Something involving the night Grandpa Arthur died." My breath hitched violently. The memory of Arthur Sterling's sudden, unexplained death, the massive stroke that struck down the ruthless old real estate tycoon just 1 week after altering his will, flashed behind my eyes with blinding clarity. For a decade and a half, the official narrative had been undisputed. Natural causes, advanced age, high blood pressure. "Arthur," I choked out, my hands gripping the edges of the metal table. "What about your grandfather?" "He didn't die of a stroke, Dad," Liam whispered, the words dropping like lead weights into the silence of the booth. "Mom didn't inherit Sterling Holdings because Grandpa willingly handed it over. She forced his hand. And when he threatened to rewrite the will to cut her out completely for her reckless lifestyle. She didn't act alone. Julian was already in the picture back then, working as a junior clerk in the firm, helping her source a very specific, untraceable cardiac suppressant that mimics a massive coronary. The fluorescent light above flickered violently and died, plunging the holding cubicle into a dim, amber emergency glow. I sat frozen, the blood roaring in my ears. The entire foundation of the Sterling Empire, the very crown Clara wore with such aristocratic arrogance, was built upon patricide. A calculated, cold-blooded murder executed by the woman I had slept beside for 15 years, aided and abetted by the very legal parasite she later brought into our bed. "Why didn't you go to the police, Liam?" I asked, my voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of rage and awe. "Why bring this to me?" "Because the police in Seattle are bought and paid for by Sterling Holdings, and federal prosecutors don't care about family secrets unless you hand them a guillotine," Liam said, his voice returning to that eerie, terrifying calm. "If I walked into a precinct with this, Clara's high-priced legal team would bury me in juvenile detention before sunset, and you'd rot in this federal hole until you died of old age. But you, Dad, you know how to wield a blade. You've been waiting 15 years for the right angle." He slid the titanium drive down the narrow slot at the bottom of the bulletproof glass partition. It landed with a dull, heavy clack on my side of the table. I reached out slowly, my bruised fingers closing around the cold metal of the drive. It felt heavy, heavier than any legal document, heavier than any corporate portfolio. It felt like the beating heart of an empire ready to be carved out from the inside. "What do you want, Liam?" I asked, looking up into my son's eyes. "When this is over, when the house of cards comes crashing down and your mother and Julian lose everything, what do you want from me?" Liam stood up slowly, pushing his metal chair back against the cinder-block wall with a sharp screech that echoed down the concrete corridor. He didn't smile. He adjusted his prep school blazer, tucked his hands into his pockets, and looked down at me with an expression of absolute, terrifying finality. "I don't want their money, Dad," Liam said quietly, turning toward the heavy steel exit door. "I just want to watch them burn in the same fog they locked you in. Burn every last piece of them down to ash. And when you're done, make sure there's nothing left of the Sterling name for anyone to inherit." Before I could answer, the guard rattled the door handle from the outside. "Visitor time's up, Elliot, let's move." The heavy steel door swung open, flooding the cubicle with the harsh, sterile light of the corridor. Liam walked out without looking back, his footsteps echoing rhythmically down the hallway until they vanished entirely into the institutional hum of the facility. I sat alone in the dim amber glow of the holding booth, the small titanium drive clutched tightly in my fist, pressing so hard against my palm that the sharp edges bit deep into my skin, drawing a single bead of bright crimson blood. The trap they had built around me wasn't a prison. It was a crucible. And as I slid the drive deep into the hidden hem of my orange jumpsuit, a slow, dark, terrifying smile crept across my face in the shadows of the cell. Clara thought she had locked the master of the house in a cage. She had no idea she had just handed the key to the executioner. The rain outside the King County Correctional Facility had turned into a relentless, driving downpour, beating against the reinforced glass windows like an impatient mob demanding an entry. Back in my cell, the air was thick with the scent of cheap disinfectant and damp concrete, but my mind was completely elsewhere. Resting deep within the hidden hem of my orange jumpsuit was the titanium solid-state drive Liam had slipped across the table, a digital Pandora's box containing not only the blueprint of Clara and Julian's financial embezzlement, but also the dark, unedited video footage of Arthur Sterling's final, suffocating moments 15 years ago. The game had shifted. The trap they had so meticulously laid to bury me under a mountain of federal fraud charges was about to become the very guillotine that severed their heads. But before I could deploy the ultimate strike, I needed a catalyst, a disruption within their tightly knit circle of betrayal that would shatter their arrogance from the inside out. And as it turned out, the first crack in their alliance was already forming far downtown, inside the gleaming glass-walled executive suite of Sterling Holdings. The executive boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Sterling Tower was a monument to corporate intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Seattle skyline, though today the view was entirely swallowed by the heavy, oppressive gray fog rolling off Puget Sound. Seated at the head of the massive mahogany conference table was Clara, radiant in a tailored charcoal St. John pantsuit, her expression a masterclass in glacial composure. To her right sat Julian Vance, his designer suit impeccably pressed, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the harsh fluorescent glare as he reviewed a portfolio of newly acquired assets. They were celebrating. The corporate board had officially ratified Clara as the permanent CEO and chairwoman of Sterling Holdings, while my name had been systematically scrubbed from every plaque, directory, and digital record in the building. To the business world, Thomas Elliott was nothing more than a disgraced, over-the-hill executive who had succumbed to greed and paranoia, currently awaiting trial in a federal holding facility. "The transition is complete," Julian murmured, leaning back in his leather ergonomic chair and flashing a self-satisfied smirk toward Clara. He reached across the table, his fingers lightly brushing hers over a stack of legal documents. "By the end of the quarter, the remaining minority shareholders will be bought out, and will have complete, unencumbered control over the entire portfolio. Your late father would have been proud, Clara. We've finally purged the dead weight." Clara offered a rare, genuine smile, her eyes softening as she looked at her lawyer, her co-conspirator, her lover. "It took longer than expected, Julian. Thomas was always more stubborn than he looked. A provincial scavenger who somehow managed to latch onto our bloodline for 15 years. But his utility has expired. Let him rot in federal custody." Before Julian could respond, the heavy soundproof oak doors of the boardroom abruptly swung open. Neither Clara nor Julian looked up immediately, assuming it was merely the executive assistant bringing in fresh coffee or quarterly audit reports. But the footsteps that echoed across the thick Persian rug were not the hesitant steps of an employee. They were heavy, measured, and carried a chilling aura of absolute authority. I didn't realize meetings of this magnitude could take place without the primary stakeholders' consent. A sweet, melodic, yet ice-cold voice pierced the heavy silence of the room. Clara stiffened. Julian's head snapped up sharply, his smirk vanishing instantly as his eyes locked onto the figure standing at the doorway. It wasn't me, it was Chloe. My 22-year-old daughter stood framed in the doorway, dressed not in her usual collegiate streetwear, but in a severe, expensive black Prada blazer that mirrored her mother's corporate armor. Her hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, and her face bore that exact same aristocratic, chilling sneer that Clara wore when she wanted to crush an adversary. Behind her stood two unfamiliar men in sharp charcoal suits, not corporate executives, but high-powered federal asset recovery attorneys from a boutique firm in New York known for aggressive hostile takeovers. "Chloe?" Clara said, her voice sharpening with a mixture of confusion and maternal irritation. "What on earth are you doing here? This is an executive board session. You have no business in—" "Mother, please!" Chloe interrupted, her voice cutting through the air like a razor blade. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked straight to the center of the mahogany table, pulled out the chair directly opposite Clara, and sat down with deliberate, agonizing slowness. "Let's dispense with the maternal lectures. We both know that business is the only language this family has ever spoken." Julian frowned, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table, trying to regain his professional authority. "Chloe, honey, your mother and I are in the middle of a critical strategic review. Whatever college drama or allowance issue you're dealing with can wait until— Save the condescending honey routine for when you're alone in your downtown penthouse, Julian," Chloe snapped, her eyes flashing with sudden venomous hostility that made Julian physically recoil in his chair. She turned her gaze to one of the attorneys standing behind her. "Open the portfolios." The attorney stepped forward, dropping 3 thick, leather-bound folders onto the polished mahogany surface right in front of Clara and Julian. Clara's brow furrowed deeply. She picked up the top folder, flipped open the heavy cover, and began scanning the first page. Within 3 seconds, the color completely drained from her face. Her breathing hitched, and her manicured fingers began to tremble violently against the paper. What is this?" Clara whispered, her voice cracking as she stared at the dense rows of financial data, corporate assignments, and voting share transfers. "That," Chloe said, leaning forward, resting her chin on her intertwined fingers with a terrifyingly serene smile, "is a controlling 51% voting block of Sterling Holdings, legally transferred, notarized, and executed under a dormant secondary trust that Grandpa Arthur established the day I was born, a trust that bypassed both you and your precious legal counsel here, Mother." Julian leaped out of his chair, the legs screeching loudly against the floorboards. "That's impossible! No such trust exists within the corporate charter. I audited every single historical document in this firm myself." "You audited what my mother allowed you to see, Julian," Chloe corrected smoothly, her eyes locking onto the panicking lawyer with absolute contempt. "Did you really think I spent the last 4 years at Wharton studying fashion merchandising? I've been watching you two play house, treat my father like a doormat, and systematically loot a multi-million-dollar empire while assuming everyone else around you was too stupid to notice." Clara slammed her hands down onto the table, standing up so fast her chair fell backward onto the rug. Her face was twisted in a mask of absolute fury and disbelief. "You ungrateful little bitch! Everything you have, every designer bag you wear, every luxury afforded to you comes from this company. You think you can just waltz in here and—" "I didn't waltz in, Mother. I executed a hostile takeover," Chloe interrupted, her voice rising just enough to command the entire room, cold and absolute. She turned her head toward the doorway. "You can come in now." The boardroom doors opened wider, and 2 federal marshals, accompanied by a senior investigator from the Department of Justice, walked calmly into the room. They didn't look at Clara. They didn't look at Chloe. Their eyes were fixed entirely on one man, Julian Vance. Julian's face went from pale to a terrifying, deathly ash gray. He took a staggering step backward, his hands instinctively coming up as if to ward off an invisible blow. No, wait. There's been some mistake. I am the chief legal counsel. Julian Vance, you are under arrest for corporate embezzlement, grand larceny, international money laundering, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud," the lead investigator announced, stepping forward and pulling a pair of cold steel handcuffs from his belt. Before Julian could bolt toward the private elevator, the two marshals intercepted him, slamming his arms behind his back with practiced brutality. The metallic click-clack of the handcuffs echoed sharply through the high-end boardroom, shattering the illusion of aristocratic invincibility that Julian had hidden behind for years. "Clara, do something!" Julian shrieked, struggling frantically against the marshals as they hauled him toward the exit. "This is a setup! She's bluffing! Clara!" Clara didn't move. She stood frozen at the end of the table, staring at the man she had loved, the accomplice she had trusted to bury her husband's legacy, being dragged out of the executive suite like a common criminal. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the muffled hum of the HVAC system and the driving rain lashing against the glass walls outside. Once the heavy oak doors closed behind Julian and the federal agents, a heavy, suffocating quiet settled over the room. Clara slowly turned her head, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated venom as she stared across the table at her own flesh and blood. Her voice was a low, trembling hiss. You planned all of this. You worked with Julian. You watched him undermine your father. You let him believe he was safe. All so you could pull the rug out from under both of us and steal the crown." Chloe remained seated, her posture impeccably straight, her expression an unreadable mask of absolute coldness. She picked up her crystal water glass, took a slow, measured sip, and set it back down precisely on the coaster. "Don't flatter yourself, Mother," Chloe said quietly, her voice devoid of any warmth or filial affection. "I didn't do it to steal your crown. I did it because in this family, power doesn't belong to the loudest voice or the most reckless heart. It belongs to whoever holds the sharpest knife." She stood up slowly, smoothing down the front of her Prada blazer, towering over Clara, who stood shaken and isolated at the end of the mahogany table. "Your reign is over, Mother," Chloe whispered, leaning in close. "Enjoy your new office. Or better yet, enjoy packing your bags. Because by tomorrow morning, the locks on the Magnolia estate are being changed, and you'll be sharing a very different kind of view with Julian." Without another word, Chloe turned on her heel and walked toward the private elevator, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor until the doors slid open and swallowed her whole. Left alone in the cavernous, silent boardroom, Clara sank slowly back into her chair, her hands trembling as she stared at the empty space where Julian had stood just moments before. The empire she had stolen through murder and deception was slipping through her fingers like dry sand, dismantled not by an outside enemy, but by the very monsters she and her bloodline had bred. And down in the dark, cold confines of the King County Correctional Facility, as I sat on my steel bunk holding the titanium drive containing the ultimate truth, I knew that the first domino had fallen. The house of cards was collapsing, and the final devastating reckoning was only just beginning. The rain had finally subsided over Seattle, leaving behind a heavy, stagnant mist that clung to the concrete and glass like a damp shroud. Inside the high-security visitation room of the King County Correctional Facility, the air was dead and smelled faintly of floor wax and stale coffee. I sat alone on the bolted steel stool, staring at the thick sheet of scratched, bulletproof glass. The titanium solid-state drive Liam had given me rested securely in my palm, its matte black surface cool against my skin. It was a digital vault of absolute ruin, but little did I know, the greatest devastation of all was yet to be unsealed. The heavy steel door at the end of the corridor clanked open, and the guard shoved someone through. It wasn't Liam. It wasn't a federal marshal or a public defender. It was Clara. She looked a shadow of the woman who had lorded over the Magnolia Mansion just a week ago. Her designer charcoal St. John pantsuit was unpressed, her chestnut hair fell in disarray around her drawn face, and the immaculate makeup she wore like body armor was smudged beneath hollow, bloodshot eyes. The hostile takeover by our daughter Chloe, combined with Julian's sudden arrest and the freezing of her corporate assets, had systematically stripped away her pristine aristocracy in less than 48 hours. She shuffled toward the visitor's booth, her footsteps heavy and hesitant. She pulled out the metal chair on the opposite side of the glass, sat down with a trembling sigh, and slowly picked up the plastic telephone receiver. I mirrored her movement, raising the receiver to my ear while keeping my eyes locked onto hers through the scratched partition. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavier than any physical barrier, charged with 15 years of bitter resentment, mutual contempt, and deep, festering betrayal. "You did this," Clara whispered finally, her voice cracking, filled with a raw, venomous hatred that defied her pathetic appearance. "From the very beginning, you orchestrated all of this. You let me humiliate you. You let me treat you like dirt. You let Julian think he had won, all so you could pull the strings from the shadows and watch us tear each other apart." I didn't blink. I didn't smile. I let my gaze remain completely flat, a mirror reflecting the hollow ruin of her life. "You built a house out of sand, Clara," I replied, my voice steady and low, cutting cleanly through the static of the intercom. "You killed your own father to seize a throne you didn't earn. You treated human lives like disposable currency, and you surrounded yourself with sycophants who loved your money more than your soul." I merely stopped propping up the walls. Clara slammed her fist against the glass, a sharp, desperate sound that echoed through the small booth. "You think you've won? You think you're some kind of mastermind sitting on top of the world? Look at where you are. You're in a federal holding cell, facing decades behind bars." "Am I?" I tilted my head slightly, reaching into the hidden hem of my jumpsuit and pulling out a slim manila folder that my defense attorney had quietly smuggled in during his morning briefing. A document completely unrelated to the federal indictment, generated from a private, court-ordered medical subpoena I had filed weeks before my arrest. I pressed the thick envelope flat against the glass, holding it right in front of her eyes. Clara's frantic expression froze. She stared at the bold, institutional header printed across the top of the document. Scientific Genetics Laboratory, Comprehensive Paternity Verification Report. "What? What is that?" Clara's voice dropped to a terrified whisper, the color draining completely from her already ashen face. "Open it," I said softly. "Or rather, let me read the conclusion for you, since you've spent the last 15 years living inside a masterclass of self-deception." I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the technical medical jargon until they locked onto the final comparative analysis section. Subject 1, Chloe Elliott. Biological markers analyzed against Thomas Elliott. Result, 0% genetic compatibility. Paternity excluded. I read aloud, every syllable falling like a lead weight into the silence of the booth. Subject 2, Liam Elliott. Biological markers analyzed against Thomas Elliott. Result, 0% genetic compatibility. Paternity excluded. Clara gripped the edges of the table so hard her knuckles turned white, her breath catching in her throat in a ragged, desperate gasp. "You see, Clara," I continued, my voice remaining unnervingly calm, carrying a cold, crushing weight that immobilized her. "For 15 years, I played the part of the provincial husband, the domestic servant, the man who quietly swallowed every insult, every thuggish jibe, every claim that I was an uneducated outsider feeding off the Sterling bloodline. I tolerated it because I believed that beneath the toxicity, beneath the cruelty, I was still raising my children. I was still a father." A single tear slipped down Clara's cheek, cutting a clean path through the smudged powder on her face, but she couldn't look away from my eyes. "They aren't my children," I whispered, the truth hanging in the air like a poisoned mist. "Chloe, Liam, none of them carry a single drop of my blood. They are the product of your endless string of extramarital affairs, stretching all the way back to the months before our wedding, when you were playing the bohemian heiress while sleeping with half the country club elite." "Thomas, please," Clara choked out, her aristocratic armor completely shattered, crumbling into pathetic, broken desperation. "I can explain. It was a mistake. When we were young." "A mistake?" I cut her off sharply, my tone hardening into absolute ice. "Killing your father was a mistake. Systematically destroying a man's dignity for 15 years was a choice. But looking into the eyes of 2 children every single morning, knowing they were living lies, and using them as psychological weapons to grind me down into the dust, that wasn't a mistake, Clara. That was malice in its purest, most calculated form." Clara slumped back in her chair, burying her face in her trembling hands, letting out a choked, shuddering sob that echoed through the sterile room. The invincible queen of Sterling Holdings was gone. In her place sat a broken, terrified woman who realized too late that she had spent her entire life dancing on the edge of a blade held by a man she never truly understood. "Why?" Clara wept into her palms, her voice muffled and broken. If you knew they weren't your children, why did you stay? Why didn't you leave years ago? Why endure all of it?" I leaned forward, pressing my face as close to the glass partition as the steel frame would allow, letting a dark, terrible smile touch the corners of my lips. "Because, Clara," I whispered, the words slipping out like liquid venom, "some debts cannot be settled with a simple divorce. Some bloodlines cannot be cleansed with a financial settlement. When you invite a starving wolf into your house and treat him like a cur, you shouldn't be surprised when he spends 15 years chewing through the foundations of your entire kingdom." I closed the manila folder, sliding it back into my jumpsuit, and stood up from the metal stool without waiting for her reply. "Enjoy your new reality, Clara," I said quietly, looking down at her through the scratched glass. "The trial hasn't even started yet, and trust me, the real show hasn't even begun." I turned away, ignoring her desperate, choked screams as she slammed her fists against the glass and signaled the guard to open the heavy steel door. As the heavy metal clanked shut behind me, plunging me back into the cold, concrete corridor of the detention facility, a profound, chilling sense of peace washed over my chest. The lies were stripped away. The illusions were shattered. The players were trapped in their respective cages. And the man who had spent a decade and a half walking through the fog of Seattle was finally ready to step out into the light and watch the whole world burn to ash. The executive conference room on the 42nd floor of the Sterling Tower was bathed in the harsh, sterile glow of midday artificial lighting. Outside, the Seattle mist had cleared just enough to reveal a pale, uninviting expanse of gray sky stretching over Puget Sound. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with a triumphant, suffocating arrogance. Clara sat at the head of the mahogany table, having somehow dragged herself back from the abyss of her personal humiliation to project a fragile veneer of control. Though her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion and the lingering terror of our encounter in the detention facility, she wore her tailored charcoal St. John pantsuit like armor. To her right sat a new team of high-priced corporate defense attorneys, slick, sharp-eyed men in bespoke Italian suits hired to salvage what remained of her fractured empire after Chloe's hostile takeover and Julian's sudden arrest. They believed the worst was over. They believed that by cutting away Julian as a sacrificial lamb and isolating me in a federal holding cell, they had successfully quarantined the infection. They thought the board meeting scheduled for today would formally ratify Clara's absolute restoration as chairwoman, permanently locking me out of the corporate ledger and sealing my fate as a disgraced, forgotten footnote in the Sterling family history. The heavy oak doors swung open, and I walked into the boardroom. I wasn't wearing an orange jumpsuit anymore. My private defense counsel had managed to secure a conditional release pending an emergency pretrial evidentiary hearing, backed by a staggering array of counter-motions that had completely paralyzed the federal prosecutor's fast-track timeline. I wore a tailored midnight blue Brioni suit, my silver-streaked hair neatly combed, and my posture straight, radiating an effortless, unsettling calm that made every attorney at the table shift uncomfortably in their ergonomic chairs. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. She stared at me as if I were a ghost walking out of a shallow grave. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly before she quickly masked it with a sharp, defensive sneer. How are you out? What kind of legal technicality did you buy your way through this time?" I didn't answer her immediately. I walked slowly toward the head of the table, pulling out the chair directly opposite Clara, the seat reserved for the ultimate authority in the room. I sat down with deliberate, agonizing slowness, lacing my fingers together and resting them on the polished mahogany surface. "Good afternoon, Clara," I said, my voice rich, steady, and carrying a quiet baritone that commanded the entire room without a single raised decibel. I let my eyes sweep over her defense attorneys before locking directly onto her dilated, terrified pupils. "And good afternoon to our distinguished legal counsel. I trust my absence hasn't disrupted your little board meetings too severely." One of Clara's new attorneys, a silver-haired shark named Harrison Vance, no relation to Julian, but cut from the exact same cloth, cleared his throat aggressively and leaned forward. "Mr. Elliot," Harrison began, his tone dripping with patronizing condescension. "Let's dispense with the theatrics. We are well aware of the federal indictments currently pending against your name regarding asset manipulation and server tampering. Your presence in this corporate suite is a direct violation of—" "Quiet, Harrison," I interrupted softly, never breaking eye contact with Clara. The attorney blinked, taken aback by the casual dismissal. "Excuse me?" "I said be quiet," I repeated, my voice dropping an octave, carrying a chilling razor-sharp edge that made the lawyer snap his mouth shut. I reached slowly into the inside pocket of my jacket, pulled out a slim, leather-bound folder embossed with the seal of the Federal District Court, and slid it across the mahogany table directly toward Clara. Clara didn't touch it. She stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake coil ready to strike. "Open it, Clara," I urged quietly. "It's not an indictment, it's an inventory." With trembling, manicured fingers, Clara reached out, flipped open the heavy leather cover, and began scanning the dense financial statements printed on the crisp parchment inside. Within seconds, the fragile veneer of composure she had managed to assemble completely shattered. Her face turned the color of chalk, her jaw dropping open in a silent, horrified gasp as her eyes darted frantically across rows of numbers, account numbers, and international routing codes. This isn't possible," Clara breathed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched panic. "These accounts, the offshore reserves in Zurich, the Cayman holdings, these are tied to Sterling Holdings' primary capital. When?" I tilted my head, offering her a slow, terrifyingly serene smile. "Clara, my dear, you've spent the last 15 years operating under the blissful delusion that because your father handed you a majority voting share on a silver platter, you actually understood how the engine of this empire was built." Harrison snatched the folder out of Clara's trembling hands, his eyes scanning the documents. As he read further, the arrogant color drained from his own face, replaced by a sudden profound sweat beading along his hairline. He looked up at me, his professional veneer completely incinerated. "These aren't just corporate accounts," Harrison stammered, his voice laced with genuine disbelief. "These are senior debt obligations, structural liens. You've cross-collateralized every single commercial real estate asset owned by Sterling Holdings against a private holding company registered in Delaware." He slammed the folder down onto the table. "Who owns that holding company? That entity controls over 80% of the corporate debt." "I do," I answered softly, leaning back in my chair and crossing my legs. The boardroom erupted into chaos. Clara's other defense attorneys began shouting over one another, demanding injunctions, emergency audits, and immediate court filings. Clara herself slumped back into her chair, her hands clutching at her chest as she stared at me as if I were a demon incarnate. You lied to me," Clara choked out, tears of absolute rage and terror spilling over her lower lashes. "Every day for 15 years, you played the pathetic, abused, penniless outsider. You let me step on you, you let me humiliate you, you let me treat you like dirt." "I didn't let you, Clara. I invited you to," I corrected her, my voice cutting through the shouting attorneys like a cold wind across an open moor. I unbuttoned the cuffs of my Brioni jacket, folding them back with meticulous care, letting my mind drift back 15 years. Back to the very beginning of this nightmare, to the day I first walked into the Sterling estate as an ambitious, hungry young real estate developer who had dared to cross paths with Arthur Sterling's golden empire. When Arthur discovered that his beloved daughter Clara had chosen a poor, unpolished land developer from an ordinary background, he didn't just disapprove. He systematically tried to destroy me. He used his political influence, his corrupt municipal judges, and his corporate muscle to crush my early development projects, driving my first company into bankruptcy, blacklisting my name across the Pacific Northwest, and publicly humiliating me at high society galas where Clara paraded me around like an exotic, embarrassing pet. I endured it because I had to. I watched from the shadows as Arthur laughed over scotch, boasting about how easily he could erase a man's entire life's work with a single phone call. And then, one evening, Arthur died. The official medical report blamed a massive stroke brought on by advanced age and high blood pressure. But the truth, the dark, rotting secret locked away in the family archives, was far more pedestrian and far more lethal. Clara, desperate to secure her inheritance before Arthur could execute a threatened amendment to his will cutting her out entirely for her reckless liaisons, had conspired with a junior corporate clerk named Julian Vance to quietly administer a potent, untraceable cardiac suppressant into her father's nightly scotch. I knew about it within 48 hours. I found the discarded vial in the master suite wastebasket before the paramedics even arrived. I could have gone to the police. I could have exposed her, had her arrested, and thrown her in a cell 15 years ago. But a prison sentence was too merciful for a woman who viewed human beings as disposable trash. Death was too quick an exit for a family built on greed, patricide, and unmitigated cruelty. So I chose a different path. I engineered a masterpiece of psychological warfare. I married her. I stepped willingly into the golden cage of the Sterling estate, put on the mask of the submissive, inadequate, browbeaten husband, and spent 5,475 days absorbing every curse, every insult, every thuggish jibe, every act of psychological torture she, her father, and her social circle could invent. I let her believe she was the master of the puppet strings, while every single day I quietly, methodically, legally rewrote the foundational DNA of her entire empire. Every real estate acquisition Sterling holdings made over the past decade was funneled through shell corporations I controlled. Every zoning permit was secured using my private capital. Every corporate loan was underwritten by debt instruments bearing my hidden digital signature. They thought they were building a fortress to keep me out. In reality, they were building a high-end tomb, and I had been holding the master key the entire time. "You asked me why I stayed, Clara," I whispered, breaking the silence of the boardroom as the panicked shouting of the defense attorney slowly faded into a dull background hum. "You thought it was because I was weak. You thought I was trapped by your wealth, your social standing, your aristocratic bloodline." I leaned forward, placing both palms flat on the mahogany table, my eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying absolute intensity. "I stayed because I wanted to watch you build your entire life, your entire identity, your entire pride upon a mountain of sand. And then, when you reached the absolute peak of your arrogance, I wanted to pull the rug out from under your feet and let you experience what it feels like to suffocate in the exact same fog you forced me to breathe for 15 years. Clara opened her mouth, gasping for air like a fish thrown onto dry land, but no sound came out. Her eyes rolled back slightly, and she slid sideways out of her executive chair, collapsing in a crumpled heap onto the thick Persian rug beneath the mahogany table. Her defense attorneys panicked, scrambling out of their seats to minister to her, shouting for an ambulance, pressing panic buttons on the wall. I didn't stand up. I didn't offer a hand. I simply reached down, picked up my leather-bound folder, and slid it back into my breast pocket. I turned my back on the chaos in the boardroom, walked past the frantic lawyers, and stepped into the private executive elevator. As the heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing off the reflections of the panic-stricken room behind me, I reached up, undid my cufflinks, and smiled into the mirrored glass wall. The trap within the trap had finally sprung, and as the elevator descended smoothly toward the lobby, out into the cold, gray Seattle mist, I knew that the empire was mine, down to the very last grain of sand. The rain in Seattle had returned, a steady, rhythmic downpour that washed over the glass facade of the Sterling Tower like tears streaming down a cold pane of glass. Inside my private study on the top floor of the newly rebranded Elliott Sterling Corporation, the room was shrouded in twilight shadows, illuminated only by the faint, pulsing amber glow of a single desk lamp. For 15 years, this room had belonged to Arthur Sterling, a place where he sat smoking imported Cuban cigars, reviewing legal documents designed to crush competitors, and plotting how to humiliate an ambitious young land developer from the wrong side of the tracks. After his death, Clara had claimed it as a shrine to her father's ruthless legacy, keeping his leather high-backed chair locked behind a heavy mahogany desk, daring anyone else to sit in it. Tonight I sat in that exact chair. My fingers rested lightly on the cold, polished mahogany as my eyes swept across the room, taking in the framed historical photographs of Seattle's shoreline, the heavy velvet drapes, and the antique grandfather clock ticking away the seconds in the corner. Each tick felt like a heartbeat counted down to absolute zero for the people who had tried to erase my existence. The legal transformation was already complete. By sunrise, court orders had been served across the state of Washington, freezing every personal asset, bank account, and trust fund bearing Clara's name. The high-priced defense attorneys who had strutted into the boardroom hours earlier had vanished like ghosts, their retainers bouncing off empty, court-sequestered accounts. Sterling Holdings, the crown jewel of the Pacific Northwest real estate market, was no longer a family legacy. It was a wholly owned subsidiary of a Delaware holding company bearing my true name, Thomas Elliott, the man they thought they had domesticated, broken, and buried. The heavy oak door of the study clicked open, breaking the silence of the room. I didn't turn around immediately. I listened to the hesitant, uneven footsteps shuffling across the thick Persian rug. Steps that carried no arrogance, no aristocratic pride, only the hollow, rattling cadence of absolute defeat. Clara stopped a few feet from the edge of the mahogany desk. When I slowly turned the chair around to face her, the sight was almost theatrical in its tragedy. She wore no makeup. Her chestnut hair hung in damp, unwashed strands around her hollow cheeks, and her designer emerald gown from the night of our supposed destruction was replaced by a plain, oversized gray wool sweater that hung loosely on her frail frame. The queen of the Seattle elite had been stripped of every royal vestige, reduced to a trespasser standing in the ruins of her own kingdom. "They wouldn't let me pass the lobby security," Clara whispered, her voice cracked, hoarse, and devoid of the sharp, melodic cruelty that had tormented me for 5,475 days. The guards said I needed an appointment. To enter my own father's house. To enter my own company." "It's not your company anymore, Clara," I said, my voice rich, steady, and chillingly calm. "And this hasn't been your father's house since the night you and Julian poured a cardiac suppressant into his nightly scotch." Clara flinched violently, stepping backward as if struck by an invisible physical blow. Her eyes widened in absolute horror, the color draining entirely from her face until she looked like a corpse standing upright. How do you know about that?" she gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, her breath catching in her throat in a ragged, terrified sob. We burned the records. Julian checked every medical file. Julian is a corporate lawyer, Clara, not a forensic pathologist," I interrupted, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the mahogany desk. "When a man of Arthur Sterling's age dies of a sudden, unexplained myocardial infarction 24 hours after threatening to alter his will, people tend to look the other way if a wealthy, grieving daughter pays off the right county coroner. But paperwork can be shredded. Organic chemical residues in crystal decanters leave a very different kind of paper trail when you know where to look." She collapsed into the leather guest chair opposite the desk, burying her face in her trembling hands as the full, crushing weight of her reality finally crashed down upon her. The arrogance, the contempt, the absolute entitlement that had defined her entire existence evaporated into thin air, leaving behind only the pathetic, shivering shell of a murderer who realized too late that she had invited her own executioner into her bed. "Why?" Clara sobbed into her palms, her voice muffled, breaking with every syllable. "If you knew I killed him, if you knew I cheated on you, if you knew the children weren't yours from the very beginning, why didn't you just walk away? Why spend 15 years playing this sick, torturous game?" I stood up slowly from Arthur Sterling's high-backed chair, walking around the mahogany desk until I stood right in front of her. I towered over her slumped figure, my shadow casting a long, dark silhouette across the floorboards. "Because walking away is for victims, Clara," I said quietly, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that vibrated through the silent room. And I wasn't a victim. I was a man seeking restitution for a debt that could only be paid in full. I reached into the inner pocket of my Brioni jacket and pulled out a faded, dog-eared newspaper clipping from 16 years ago, long before I ever met Clara, long before the high society galas and the waterfront mansion in Magnolia. I dropped it gently onto her lap. Clara hesitantly lowered her trembling hands and looked down at the paper. The headline glared up at her in bold black ink. "Tragic collapse of Elliott & Sons Development. Local builder driven to bankruptcy after targeted municipal boycott." Beneath the headline was a photograph of a younger man, my identical twin brother, David, standing outside an unfinished construction site that had been systematically demolished by a series of fraudulent municipal zoning violations and engineered credit freezes orchestrated by a ruthless real estate conglomerate known as Sterling Holdings. "David was the builder in the family," I whispered, letting the memories wash over me like ice water. "He had the vision, the passion, the honesty. He believed that hard work and architectural integrity were enough to build a life in Seattle. But your father didn't see a competitor. He saw an ant crawling across his golden floorboards. Arthur crushed David's company just for sport, driving him to financial ruin and ultimately to a quiet, lonely death from a stress-induced stroke in a rundown motel room on the outskirts of Tacoma." Clara stared at the clipping, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrifying comprehension. You're not Thomas," she whispered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely articulate the words. "Thomas Elliot he was a small-time land speculator from a working-class neighborhood. How did you—" "Thomas Elliot was my older brother by 3 years," I corrected her smoothly, stepping closer. "When David died, I didn't just grieve. I inherited his unfinished business, his architectural credentials, and his burning, unquenchable desire for justice. I spent 2 years legally and physically transforming myself into Thomas Elliot, studying his mannerisms, mastering his real estate techniques, and meticulously crafting a profile that would eventually catch the eye of the rebellious Bohemian Harris of Sterling Holdings." I leaned down, my face inches from hers, my eyes locking onto her dilated, terror-stricken pupils. "You thought you picked up a stray dog from the streets when you married me, Clara," I whispered. "You thought you were domesticating an ambitious provincial outsider who would spend his entire life thanking you for the crumbs falling from your father's table. But every insult you hurled, every thuggish jibe you made at the breakfast table, every time you looked down your nose at me, you were just feeding the wolf you invited into your own fold." Clara shook her head frantically, sliding off the chair onto her knees on the Persian rug, clutching at the hem of my trousers in a desperate, pathetic display of survival instinct. "Please, Thomas, please," she wept, pressing her forehead against my shoes. "I have nothing left. No money, no home, no friends. Take everything. Take the company. Take the mansion. Take my life if you want it. Just don't leave me like this." I looked down at the woman who had spent 15 years treating me like dirt beneath her feet, feeling neither anger nor pity, only a vast, empty expanse of absolute closure. "I won't take your life, Clara," I said softly, stepping back and pulling my trousers from her trembling grip. "Death is too simple, too quick an escape for a debt as large as yours. Besides, the federal prosecutor is already reviewing the financial wire transfers and the forensic evidence regarding your father's cardiac arrest. You'll have plenty of time to reflect on your choices in a federal penitentiary, surrounded by cold concrete, steel bars, and absolute silence." I turned my back on her, walking back toward the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that overlooked the Seattle waterfront. Outside, the rain continued to pour, blurring the city lights into a smear of gray and amber across the glass. Behind me, the heavy oak doors of the study burst open, and 2 security guards rushed into the room, their faces grim and professional. "Mr. Elliot," the lead guard nodded respectfully. "Should we escort her out?" "Yes," I said without turning around, my voice steady and resolute. "Take her out of my sight, and make sure she leaves through the freight elevator exactly the way a trespasser should." "No, no, Thomas, please!" Clara screamed as the guards grabbed her arms, hauling her up from the floor and dragging her thrashing, sobbing form toward the doorway. Her desperate cries echoed down the corridor until the heavy oak doors slammed shut, cutting her off from the world forever. The study fell back into a profound, suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock and the steady patter of rain against the glass. I stood alone in the dark room, looking out at the sprawling, rain-drenched skyline of Seattle, a city that had tried to break my family twice, and twice had bowed down to my name. I reached up slowly, unbuttoned my cuffs, and let out a long, slow breath that felt like shedding a skin I had worn for 15 years. The game was over. The trap had sprung. The ghost of the past had claimed its final victory. And as I turned back toward the mahogany desk to begin a new chapter under my true name, the The Seattle fog outside rolled in thick and heavy, wrapping its arms around the empire I had finally conquered, locking it away in the silence of the night. The Seattle fog was not merely weather. It was a physical entity, a thick, suffocating shroud that rolled in off the dark waters of Puget Sound with the deliberate malice of an invading army. By midnight, it had swallowed the coastline entirely, completely erasing the boundary between the earth and the sky. The Magnolia waterfront estate, a monument of glass and steel that had once stood as a proud beacon of aristocratic wealth, was now entirely isolated, cut off from the rest of the world by a wall of impenetrable white mist. Inside the grand living room, there was no warmth. The massive stone fireplace sat cold and empty, its hearth swept clean like a tomb. The designer lighting had been deliberately dimmed to a harsh, flickering amber, casting long, skeletal shadows across the vaulted ceilings and the imported Italian leather sofas. Clara sat huddled in the corner of the oversized velvet sofa, clutching a woolen throw blanket tightly around her narrow shoulders, though it could do nothing to stop the deep, bone-chilling shiver that racked her frame. Her hair was tangled and unwashed, her makeup entirely washed away by hours of silent, hopeless crying. The invincible queen of Sterling Holdings was gone. In her place sat a shattered, terrified woman stripped of every illusion of power. A few feet away, pacing restlessly across the herringbone oak floor, was Chloe. The 22-year-old collegiate mastermind who had orchestrated a ruthless, hostile takeover of her mother's empire now looked like a cornered animal. Her designer Prada blazer was wrinkled, her high-end makeup smeared, her manicured fingers incessantly picking at the cuticles of her left hand. The realization that her brilliant corporate coup had been nothing more than a minor, calculated speed bump in my grand design had finally crushed her arrogant spirit, and sitting quietly in the single armchair near the hallway was Liam. I was completely motionless. He didn't look at Clara, nor did he look at his sister. He stared blankly down at his hands, his expression an unreadable mask of cold detachment. He knew the truth long before anyone else. He had watched the machinery grind down from the digital shadows, and now he sat in the center of the ruins, waiting for the final act to play out. The heavy silence of the room was broken only by the low, melancholic howling of the wind sweeping off the sound, rattling the reinforced glass panels of the floor-to-ceiling windows. Suddenly, the dual internal locking mechanism of the heavy oak front doors engaged with a loud mechanical clack. All three heads snapped toward the entryway. The heavy doors swung open slowly, the hinges making a dry, echoing groan in the stillness. Footsteps echoed across the marble foyer, measured, deliberate, unhurried strides that carried the weight of absolute authority. I stepped out of the shadows and into the amber glow of the living room. I wore a simple dark cashmere sweater over charcoal trousers, my silver-streaked hair neat, my posture straight and commanding. I wasn't the submissive, brow-beaten husband who used to stand quietly by this exact fireplace holding a cold cup of coffee. I was the master of the house, the sole owner of the estate, and the architect of their total destruction. Clara shrank back into the corner of the sofa, letting out a sharp, ragged gasp, while Chloe froze in her tracks, her eyes widening with a mixture of terror and fierce, unyielding hatred. "Thomas!" Clara choked out, her voice trembling violently as she pulled the blanket higher around her neck. What is the meaning of this? Why are the doors locked? Why have you cut off the security lines?" I didn't answer immediately. I walked slowly over toward the wet bar, picked up a heavy crystal decanter filled with aged bourbon, and poured a small amber measure into a heavy-bottomed glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the fiery liquid burn the back of my throat before setting the glass down on the quartz counter with a soft, clinical clink. "The doors are locked, Clara, because a house built on sand requires a very specific kind of containment," I said, my voice rich, steady, and carrying a quiet baritone that filled every corner of the vast room. "As for the security lines, well, the outside world has quite enough chaos to deal with tonight. There's no need to broadcast family matters to the local police precincts just yet." Chloe took a sharp step forward, her voice rising in a shrill, desperate pitch that scraped against the silence. "You can't do this. You have no right to hold us here. The courts are attorneys. They'll be looking for us by morning. You're committing kidnapping." I turned my head slowly, fixing my gaze on the young woman who had spent years plotting behind my back. "Attorneys, Chloe?" I let out a low, dry chuckle that held zero humor. "Which attorneys? The ones whose retainers bounced off court-frozen accounts this morning? Or perhaps Julian Vance, who is currently sitting in a federal holding cell 20 miles away, desperately trying to figure out which of his co-conspirators sold him out first?" Chloe flinched, biting her lower lip so hard, a tiny drop of crimson blood appeared on her skin. She stepped back, collapsing heavily into an armchair, completely defeated by the sheer, crushing weight of reality. I walked toward the center of the room, stopping right between the sofa where Clara sat trembling and the chairs occupied by the two children who bore no drop of my blood. "For 15 years, I began, my voice dropping to a low, hypnotic register, I stood in this exact room. I listened to Clara lecture me on spatial awareness, telling me my provincial habits didn't belong in high society. I listened to you, Chloe, mock my career while spending my capital on designer labels. And I watched you, Liam, retreat into the digital dark because the warmth in this house was entirely manufactured." Clara burst into tears, her hands flying to her face as the suffocating wave of guilt and terror washed over her. "I'm sorry, Thomas. Please. I was wrong. Take everything, just let us go." "Sorry?" I tilted my head, looking down at her with a chilling clinical detachment. "Is that the word you used when you administered a cardiac suppressant to your own father in this very study 15 years ago to secure his estate? Is that the word you used when you conspired with Julian to frame me for corporate embezzlement and lock me away in a federal penitentiary?" The living room went dead silent. The wind outside seemed to hold its breath against the glass. Chloe stared at her mother in absolute paralyzing horror. "Mom, what is he talking about? Grandpa Arthur didn't. He died of a stroke." "He died of poison, Chloe," I said quietly, turning my eyes toward my supposed daughter. "Administered by the woman who raised you, executed with the legal assistance of the man she brought into our bed. A family built on patricide, sustained by deceit, and decorated with stolen wealth." Liam slowly lifted his head from his hands. For the first time all evening, his eyes met mine through the dim amber light. There was no fear in his gaze, only a dark, twisted understanding, the quiet acknowledgement of two predators who recognized the game had reached its absolute conclusion. "You planned all of this from the very beginning, didn't you?" Liam whispered, his voice steady and remarkably calm for a 17-year-old boy sitting in the ruins of his family. "Every single day, every insult, every trap. You didn't just endure it, you weaponized it." "Yes, Liam," I answered softly, walking over and placing a hand gently on the back of his chair. "When you spend 15 years walking through the fog, you learn to see through the mist while everyone else is still stumbling in the dark. I didn't build this estate, but I built the foundation it rests upon. And when the foundation rots from the inside out, the house must come down." I stepped back to the center of the room, looking at the three figures seated before me, the woman who had tried to destroy me, the daughter who had tried to out-manipulate me, and the boy who had watched it all burn from behind a computer screen. "The night is still young, and the fog outside is only getting thicker," I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality as I turned toward the grand staircase leading to the master suite. "Rest while you can. By tomorrow morning the sun will rise over an empty estate, and the name Sterling will exist only as a cautionary tale in the financial archives of Seattle." Without waiting for a reply, I walked away from the living room, my footsteps climbing steadily up the polished oak stairs, leaving them alone in the flickering amber shadows of the great hall. Behind me, the wind howled against the glass, and the heavy Seattle fog crept further under the doors, wrapping its cold, damp arms around the house, claiming every last corner of the Magnolia estate in absolute, enduring silence. The air inside the master bedroom of the Magnolia estate was heavy, stagnant, and chilled by the damp draft seeping through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows that overlooked the pitch-black waters of Puget Sound. Outside, the Seattle fog pressed against the glass like a spectral army, muting the world into a monochromatic blur of gray and absolute black. Inside, the silence was thick enough to choke on, broken only by the erratic, shallow breathing of Clara, who sat huddled on the edge of the king-size bed where we had spent 15 years playing the roles of husband and wife. She looked small now, completely stripped of the fierce aristocratic armor that had defined her existence. Her hair was a matted nest of chestnut strands, her eyes hollowed out by hours of silent terror, and her hands locked tightly together in her lap as if trying to hold the crumbling pieces of her sanity in place. Standing near the private balcony doors was Chloe. Her posture was rigid, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, though the haughty sneer that usually accompanied her expression had been replaced by a pale, twitching mask of denial. She kept glancing toward the heavy oak door as if waiting for a rescue team, a lawyer, or a federal marshal that would never materialize through the impenetrable fog. And sitting quietly in the velvet armchair by the fireplace was Liam. He hadn't followed his mother and sister up to the master suite in a state of panic. He had walked up behind me with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen in a jar. He knew something was coming. He knew the final layer of the onion was about to be peeled back, exposing the core rot of the entire Sterling bloodline. I stood by the mahogany dresser, pouring a finger of amber bourbon into a heavy crystal tumbler. I didn't drink it. I simply held it by the base, letting the amber liquid catch the weak, flickering amber glow of the bedside lamp. "You've spent the last few days wondering why I didn't throw you out on the street like common vagrants," I began, my voice rich, low, and steady, cutting through the heavy silence of the room like a cold blade. "You thought it was cruelty. You thought it was a sadistic game designed to prolong your psychological torture before the federal authorities finally came to lock you away." Clara raised her head slowly, her bloodshot eyes locking onto mine with a desperate, pathetic plea. "Thomas, please. Enough. If it's about the money, take it all. If it's about the company, it's yours. Just tell us what you want and let us go." "The money and the company were never the true prizes, Clara," I replied, turning my head slowly to look down at her. "They were just the scaffolding. The real structure, the foundation upon which this entire tragic little family drama was built, lies in something far more permanent. Something written in ink that no corporate restructuring or financial audit can ever wash away." I reached into the inner pocket of my cashmere sweater, pulled out a slim manila envelope bearing the official seal of the Seattle Genetic Diagnostics Institute, and tossed it gently onto the center of the plush duvet right in front of Clara. The envelope landed with a soft, muffled thud. Clara stared at it as if it were a venomous viper coil ready to strike. She didn't move. Her fingers remained locked in her lap, trembling so violently that the motion was visible across the entire room. "Open it, Chloe," I said, shifting my gaze to the young woman standing by the balcony. "You always fancied yourself the smartest person in any room. Let's see how well your analytical mind handles real data." Chloe hesitated for a fraction of a second, her jaw tightening defensively. Then, stepping forward with deliberate, rigid strides, she walked over to the bed, snatched the manila envelope off the duvet, and ripped the flap open. She pulled out a thick stack of parchment papers covered in dense medical charts, chromosomal sequences, and comparative DNA markers. Her eyes scanned the first page, then the second. Within 5 seconds, the color drained entirely from Chloe's face. Her lips parted in a silent, horrified gasp, and the papers slipped from her fingertips, scattering like dead leaves across the dark wooden floorboards. "No," Chloe whispered, stepping backward until her legs hit the edge of the velvet armchair. This is impossible. This has to be a forgery. You manipulated the lab results. You had the power to fake anything." "I didn't need to fake a single syllable, Chloe," I interrupted softly, stepping away from the dresser and walking toward the center of the room. Clara finally found the strength to move. She scrambled forward on the mattress, her hands clawing frantically at the scattered papers on the floor until she clutched the final summary page. Her eyes darted across the bold black print at the bottom of the document, and a sound escaped her throat, a raw, broken, animalistic cry of absolute, unmitigated horror. "You see," I continued, my voice dropping to a low, hypnotic register, "for years, Clara, you took great pride in reminding me that I was an outsider, a provincial land developer, from a working-class background, who didn't belong in your high society family. You threw my lack of aristocratic blood in my face every single morning across that quartz kitchen island. You believed that because I wasn't born into the Sterling dynasty, I was somehow inferior. I paused, letting the silence stretch thin and tense across the room. But you made a rather fascinating oversight, Clara. You assumed that when I entered your life 15 years ago, I came alone. You assumed Thomas Elliot was an only child. Clara's head snapped up sharply, her eyes dilated with a dawning, terrifying comprehension that seemed to freeze the very blood in her veins. "David!" she choked out, her voice dropping to a hollow, breathless rasp. "Your twin brother, David." "Ah, memory serves," I smiled coldly. "My identical twin brother, David, the brilliant young architect and builder whose company your father, Arthur Sterling, systematically destroyed through engineered municipal corruption and fraudulent credit freezes 16 years ago, driving him to financial ruin and ultimately to a lonely, stress-induced death in a rundown motel room." I took another step closer, my shadow falling over Clara and the scattered medical documents on the floor. When David died, I didn't just inherit his architectural credentials and his desire for justice. I inherited his entire biological lineage. You see, Clara, identical twins share 100% of their genetic material. To a biological sequencer, to a genetic marker panel, Thomas and David are indistinguishable. Chloe slowly sank to her knees on the floor, her hands trembling as she picked up one of the genetic comparison charts, staring in blank horror at the matching chromosomal sequences printed in bold black ink. "That means," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical tremble, "that means we aren't. Julian isn't. None of the affairs, none of the extramarital affairs you threw in my face, Clara, ever produced a child with the men you thought you were sleeping with," I said, the words dropping like lead weights into the silence. "Every single one of your little weekend liaisons, every discreet hotel rendezvous with junior executives, country club members, and even your precious legal counsel, Julian, they all yielded the exact same biological reality. Because of a rare, medically documented chromosomal dominance condition shared by my twin and me, every child you conceived during our marriage carried the exact same genetic signature." I stepped right up to the edge of the bed, looking down at Clara, who was now weeping hysterically, her body shaking with convulsive sobs as the ultimate devastating irony of her life crashed down upon her. "You spent 15 years treating me like a servant, humiliating me, trying to break my spirit, and using your children as psychological weapons to remind me I was a bloodless outsider in your sacred dynasty," I whispered, leaning in close so she could hear every single syllable. "And all along, the children you raised, the heirs to the Sterling Empire, the bloodline you protected with murder and deceit, were sired by the very family you and your father tried to erase from the earth." Liam stood up slowly from the velvet armchair. He didn't look shocked. He didn't look horrified. He looked down at the genetic charts scattered across the floor, then raised his eyes to meet mine. There was no tremor in his gaze, only a dark, terrifying clarity that mirrored the exact reflection I saw in my own mirror every morning. "So," Liam said, his voice surprisingly steady, cutting cleanly through his mother's hysterical weeping. "All of this, the entire house, the empire, the betrayal, the corporate war, wasn't just about revenge against Mom. It was about reclaiming what was stolen from our family in the first place." "Yes, Liam," I answered, turning to look directly at my nephew, the boy who had watched the world burn from behind a computer screen, carrying the exact same blood that Arthur Sterling had tried to crush into the dirt 16 years ago. "Your grandfather built an empire on sand, believing he could wash away anyone who got in his way. But water always returns to carve away the stone. And the bloodline he tried to destroy is now the sole legal and biological owner of every single brick, beam, and cent his name ever touched." Clara let out a final, piercing shriek of absolute psychological collapse, tumbling sideways off the edge of the bed onto the floor, curling into a fetal position among the scattered medical charts, weeping into the dark Persian rug. Chloe buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking silently as the grandeur of her aristocratic identity evaporated into nothingness, leaving her stranded in the ruins of a lie. I turned away from the bed, walking slowly toward the private balcony doors. I pushed them open, stepping out into the cold, damp night air of the Seattle balcony. The relentless fog swirled around me, wrapping its heavy, damp arms around my shoulders, carrying the faint, salty scent of Puget Sound and the distant roar of the city lights blinking through the mist. I stood there in the dark, breathing in the cold air, feeling the profound, absolute stillness of a war finally won. The house of cards was gone. The dynasty was leveled to ash. And as I looked out into the endless white fog, knowing that down below, the legal machinery was already moving to close the final chapter of the Sterling name, a slow, quiet smile spread across my face. The game was over. The family was ours. And the night belonged entirely to the ghost who had walked through the fog and conquered the world. The fog in Seattle does not dissipate. It merely surrenders, thinning out into a pale, ghostly haze as the first weak, bruised fingers of dawn stretch across the charcoal waters of Puget Sound. There is no glorious golden sunrise over the Magnolia waterfront estate, no triumphant burst of warm light to herald a new beginning. Instead, the morning breaks in shades of slate gray and washed-out silver, casting a cold, indifferent glare over an empire that has been reduced to a quiet, smoking ruin. Inside the Grand Master Suite, the silence is absolute. Clara lies crumpled on the dark Persian rug, her breathing shallow and irregular, trapped in the twilight zone between hysterical shock and profound catatonia. The designer clothes she wore like armor are stained and crumpled. Her aristocratic posture has vanished, replaced by the twisted, pathetic posture of a woman who has lost her mind, her wealth, her legacy, and her identity in a single weekend. Chloe sits nearby in the velvet armchair, staring blankly at her own reflection in the darkened glass of the balcony doors. Her haughty sneer is gone, replaced by a hollow, vacant expression. She realizes now that the corporate throne she fought so viciously to seize is nothing more than an empty chair sitting in an abandoned tomb. And Liam stands by the window, his hands tucked quietly into his pockets, watching the gray dawn break over the bay with that same terrifying, unblinking calm. He is the only piece of this broken puzzle that fits into the new reality, a silent heir to a dynasty built on ash and retribution. The heavy oak door of the master bedroom clicks open. I don't turn around immediately. I stand by the edge of the balcony, looking out over the manicured lawns of the estate that stretch down to the concrete seawall. I wear a simple dark wool overcoat, my silver-streaked hair brushed neatly, my hands resting calmly in my pockets. Two men in dark suits step quietly into the room. Not federal marshals this time, but senior probate attorneys representing the Elliott Sterling Holding Trust. "Mr. Elliott," the lead attorney murmurs respectfully, his voice barely disturbing the heavy quiet of the room. The final asset restructuring papers have been filed with the King County Superior Court. The transition of the estate, the corporate holdings, and all subsidiary accounts is officially complete. Sterling Holdings no longer exists. The board has been dissolved under your direct corporate mandate. "And the occupants?" I ask, my voice rich, steady, and devoid of any triumph, carrying only the flat, heavy weight of absolute closure. "The eviction notices and court-ordered relocations are scheduled for 9 o'clock, the attorney replies, glancing sideways at the crumpled figure of Clara on the floor. "Accommodations have been made at a standard municipal housing facility downtown, as per statutory requirements for destitute citizens without active asset backing." "Good," I say softly. "See that they are handled according to protocol. No special treatment, no exceptions." The attorneys nod silently, turning on their heels and exiting the room as quietly as they entered. Once the door clicks shut, I walk slowly back into the center of the master suite. I stop right beside the bed, looking down at the scattered genetic charts, the financial ledgers, and the broken remnants of a family that believed it could rule the world by stepping on everyone beneath its feet. I reach down slowly, unfasten my left cuff, and slide the heavy white gold wedding band off my finger. The ring I wore for 15,475 days, as a badge of servitude, humiliation, and silent war. I drop it onto the center of the duvet. It makes a tiny metallic bounce before settling dead center among the ruins of the manila envelopes. Clara stirs slightly, her bloodshot eyes flickering upward to meet mine. There are no words left in her. No screams, no curses, no desperate pleas. Only a quiet, bottomless terror as she looks at the man she spent a decade and a half trying to crush, realizing too late that he was the storm that swallowed her whole. "Goodbye, Clara," I say quietly, my voice leaving no ripple in the air. I turn away from the bed, ignoring the quiet, heavy breathing of the women who once ruled this house, and walk past Liam. He glances up at me, a faint, razor-thin acknowledgement passing between us. "Are you staying, Dad? Or Uncle?" Liam asks, his voice steady and low. "I'm going home, Liam," I reply, walking toward the grand hallway. There's a quiet office down by the waterfront waiting for some proper architectural blueprints. The foundation is laid. Now it's time to build something real. I walk down the curved oak staircase, my footsteps echoing rhythmically through the vast, hollow expanses of the mansion. The marble foyer is cold, touched only by the pale, artificial gray light of the false dawn filtering through the glass double doors. I push the heavy oak doors open and step outside, leaving the Magnolia estate behind me forever. The Seattle air hits my face, sharp, damp, smelling of salt, wet concrete, and the deep cleansing chill of Puget Sound. The morning mist is slowly lifting from the bay, revealing a vast open horizon stretching out toward the Pacific. I pull my overcoat tighter around my chest, button my cuffs, and begin walking down the paved stone driveway without looking back once. The house of cards has fallen. The ashes are cold. And as I step out into the gray light of a new day, I am no longer a ghost walking through the fog. I am the man who wrote the storm, and the world is finally entirely mine.